He was the puppy no one wanted. Families walked past his kennel without a second glance. His growls echoed through the shelter, earning him the cruel title of the most hated pup. Volunteers whispered about his temper, staff labeled him unadoptable, and children shrank away from his growls. The little German Shepherd puppy pressed his paw against the cold bars, eyes brimming with tears, but every day he was overlooked. Then one man walked in. He didn't choose the playful puppies wagging their tails or the sweet dogs begging for affection. He stopped in front of the smallest, angriest pup, the one everyone feared. "I'll take him," he said quietly. The room fell silent. People thought he was making a terrible mistake. But no one could have predicted the shocking bond that would change everything. Before we start, make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe. And really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. The shelter was always loud. Dogs barking for attention, paws scraping against metal, tails thumping against the bars. Families walked the aisles with hesitant smiles, pointing at wagging puppies, laughing at playful barks. But in one corner, tucked away from the rest, sat a German Shepherd pup no one wanted. His fur was matted, his eyes sharp with mistrust, and his tiny growls kept visitors at a distance. While other kennels overflowed with eager hands reaching through the bars, his remained quiet. Children pulled their parents away from him. Volunteers shook their heads. To them, he was the lost cause. Day after day, he pressed his paw against the cold steel, as if begging for a chance. But no one stopped. Families who came in searching for companionship passed him without hesitation, choosing the cheerful tails wagging nearby. The shelter staff had long since given up hope, labeling him aggressive. His file bore the red mark no puppy should ever carry, unadoptable. Rumors spread among visitors. He had bitten before, he couldn't be trusted, he would never change. And so the pup learned to stop expecting kindness. His eyes hardened, his barks grew louder, his heart quieter. Yet beneath the growls lived a wound deeper than most could see. He was not born cruel. He was made this way. The world had already failed him once. Found abandoned near a construction site, shivering and malnourished, he had been brought to the shelter with scars on his body and fear in his soul. Every hand that reached too quickly reminded him of pain. Every loud voice reminded him of fear. So he snarled. So he snapped. Not because he wanted to be hated, but because it was the only way he knew to survive. Still, late at night, when the shelter grew quiet, the mask slipped. His cries were soft then, barely audible but filled with longing. He pressed his face against the bars, watching the moonlight spill across the floor. For a fleeting moment his eyes softened, brimming with the innocence of the puppy he still was. But by morning, the walls went up again. The world saw only anger, never the broken heart inside, and so he waited day after day, the forgotten pup in the corner cage carrying the weight of a story no one had bothered to hear. The morning was quiet when Daniel pushed open the heavy shelter doors. He wasn't looking for noise or joy. He carried too much silence of his own. His eyes were tired, shadowed by months of loneliness. Friends had drifted away. His family lived far, and the house he once shared with loved ones now echoed with emptiness. A dog wasn't on his mind. At first, he had simply wandered into the shelter searching for something he couldn't name. The air smelled of disinfectant and damp fur, and the chorus of barking filled his chest with a strange mix of ache and curiosity. Volunteers greeted him warmly, eager to guide him toward the puppies everyone adored. They pointed out the playful retrievers tumbling over each other, the tiny terriers wagging their tails, the sleepy hounds curled in their beds. Each one carried a spark of hope, each one practically begging for love. Daniel smiled politely, but his steps were slow, his heart unmoved. Something inside him resisted the obvious choices. He wasn't looking for perfection, not for the easy path. He was searching for something real, something broken like him, something that still had fight left despite the scars. He moved past rows of cheerful eyes until his gaze fell toward the far corner. There, behind thick bars, sat the German Shepherd pup no one approached. The staff hesitated, exchanging glances before warning him quietly. "That one, he's difficult. He doesn't trust anyone. We don't recommend him." Daniel didn't move away. He studied the pup's piercing eyes, the way he pressed his paw silently against the bars, as if begging for recognition beneath. The growls. For a moment, Daniel saw himself reflected back, misunderstood, written off, yet still yearning for someone who wouldn't turn away. A faint growl vibrated from the pup's throat, but Daniel didn't flinch. He crouched slowly, lowering himself to the dog's level, his voice steady and calm. "You're not scary," he murmured softly. "You're just hurt." The pup's eyes widened for the briefest second, the growl breaking into silence. Behind him, the shelter worker sighed. "He'll never change. People say he's the most hated pup we've ever had." Daniel rose, his decision already made. "Then I guess I'll be the one who gives him a chance." The words felt heavy, final, and quietly defiant. The man who walked in wasn't leaving, alone. The adoption room was small, lined with metal walls and the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Daniel sat in a chair while two volunteers carefully led the German Shepherd pup inside. The leash was short, gripped tightly as if they were handling something dangerous rather than a trembling puppy. The dog's ears were pinned back, his growls low and warning. Daniel stayed calm, his hands resting loosely on his knees, making no sudden movements. He didn't see a monster in front of him, he saw fear wrapped in fur. And something inside him whispered, "Don't give up on him." The shelter manager cleared her throat nervously. "Sir, I need to be honest with you. This pup has been returned 3 times already. He snaps at people, refuses food for days, and has injured 2 volunteers. We don't want to see you hurt." Daniel listened, but his eyes never left the dog. The puppy's gaze darted between him and the door like he was trapped between fight and flight. Slowly, Daniel extended his hand, palm open, fingers relaxed. The volunteers tensed, bracing for a bite. But the dog only froze, his tiny body trembling. Seconds felt like hours. The pup's eyes welled, tears pooling in the corners as his paw inched forward. He placed it gently on Daniel's palm just for a moment, before pulling back sharply with a defensive growl. Gasps filled the room. No one had seen him make contact willingly before. Daniel's chest tightened, not from fear but from recognition. "See?" he said quietly, looking up at the staff. "He's not hateful. He's just waiting for someone to listen." The shelter workers exchanged doubtful glances, but Daniel's conviction was unshakable. His decision wasn't about logic, it was about connection. When the paperwork was slid across the table, Daniel signed without hesitation. Volunteers whispered to each other, some pitying him, others thinking he was reckless. But as the pen left the page, the adoption was official. Daniel rose, holding the leash gently, and the pup resisted, pulling back toward the kennel he had known all his life. Daniel knelt, speaking in a voice only meant for the puppy. "I know you're scared, but I promise I'm not leaving you behind." For the first time, the German Shepherd didn't growl. He just stared at Daniel as if weighing the truth of those words. The shelter doors closed behind them with a metallic thud, and for the first time, the puppy was outside those bars. The sun fell across his fur, but he didn't wag his tail like the others had. Instead, he crouched low, eyes darting at every sound. The slam of a car door, the chatter of families leaving with new pets. Daniel knelt beside him, speaking softly, letting the leash rest loose in his hand. "You're free now," he whispered. But freedom, to the little German Shepherd, didn't feel like safety. Every step toward the car was a battle of fear and mistrust. When Daniel opened the passenger door, the pup froze. His paws scraped against the pavement as if the car was a trap. Volunteers lingering nearby shook their heads knowingly. "He won't last a week," one muttered. Daniel ignored them, waiting patiently. He didn't tug, didn't force. Instead, he sat on the ground beside the car, leaving the door wide open. Minutes passed. Slowly, the pup crept forward, sniffing, growling low, testing every inch before climbing into the seat. Daniel exhaled quietly, sliding into the driver's side. It wasn't victory. It was a truce, fragile and unspoken. The drive was tense. The puppy pressed against the farthest corner of the seat, his ears back, his body trembling at every turn of the wheels. He growled when Daniel glanced his way, snapping once when the man reached for the gear shift. But Daniel didn't scold him. He just kept his eyes on the road, voice low and steady, talking as though to an old friend. "I don't need you to trust me today, just give me a chance." The words filled the car, soft but certain, and for a fleeting second the pup's growls quieted, his ears twitching. As the car pulled into Daniel's driveway, the house loomed, a modest home with peeling paint but warmth waiting inside. Daniel opened the door, stepping out first, giving the pup space. The German Shepherd hesitated, sniffing the air, his paws finally touching ground. He looked at the house, then back at Daniel, eyes still wary but less wild than before. Daniel crouched, holding out his hand once more. The pup didn't come forward, not yet, but he didn't back away either. It was the smallest of victories, but for Daniel it was everything. Their journey had only just begun. The first night was nothing like Daniel had hoped. The moment the pup entered the house, his suspicion turned to defiance. He darted from room to room, ears back, growling at every sound. A knocked-over lamp shattered across the floor. Shoes were torn apart in minutes. The once quiet home echoed with barks, yelps, and the crash of furniture. Daniel sat on the couch, exhausted, but he didn't raise his voice. He simply watched, letting the pup burn through his fear. To most, it looked like aggression. To Daniel, it was panic, the desperate fight of a soul that had never known safety. By morning, the house was in ruins. Neighbors peeked through curtains, shaking their heads. One leaned over the fence, muttering, "Told you it was a mistake, that dog's trouble." Daniel only nodded, sweeping broken glass into a pan. The pup sat in a corner, chest heaving, eyes locked on him with equal parts warning and sorrow. Daniel crouched slowly, keeping his distance but speaking gently. "You don't have to fight me," he whispered. The pup growled low, but his tail twitched, just once. It was enough for Daniel to know the battle wasn't hopeless. Days passed, each filled with trials. The pup snapped when Daniel offered food, refused to sleep in the soft bed prepared for him, and barked at every passing car outside the window. Friends stopped by and shook their heads. "You can't fix him," they said. But Daniel didn't send the dog back. At night, when the barking subsided, he would sit quietly on the floor, letting the pup circle warily before settling across the room. Patience became his weapon. Silence became his strategy. He wasn't trying to tame the dog. He was trying to prove he wouldn't leave. The breakthrough never came fast, but Daniel felt it in small moments. A quiet glance that lingered a little longer, a growl that softened before fading away, a meal eaten with less hesitation. Each fragile step stitched hope into Daniel's heart. The world saw destruction, but he saw progress hidden inside chaos. "We're going to figure this out," he told the pup one evening, sitting in the darkened living room. The puppy's ears twitched at the sound of his voice. He didn't come closer, but he didn't turn away. And for Daniel, that was enough to keep going. It happened on a rainy afternoon. Thunder rolled across the sky, and the German Shepherd pup cowered in the corner, his growls replaced with trembling whimpers. For the first time, Daniel saw fear without anger. He knelt across the room, giving space, his voice low and steady. "It's just a storm," he whispered. The pup's ears twitched at the sound. Minutes stretched in silence until, finally, the dog crawled out from his corner, his paws slow and uncertain. He didn't approach Daniel directly, but he sat closer than ever before. A crack had formed in the wall of mistrust. That night, Daniel left the bedroom door open, just in case. Hours later, he woke to the sound of soft paws on the floor. The Maui pup stood in the doorway, silhouetted by moonlight. His growl was gone, replaced by hesitation. Slowly, he padded inside, circling once before curling up on the rug. Daniel lay still, his heart pounding, afraid to break the fragile moment. The house was silent except for the steady rhythm of rain against the windows. For the first time, they shared the same space without fear ruling either of them. Sleep came easier that night. Days turned into small victories. The pup accepted food from Daniel's hand, though his teeth still grazed with caution. He allowed the leash to be clipped on without a fight, walking stiffly but not pulling away. And once, while Daniel sat reading on the couch, the dog climbed onto the opposite end, curling his body tightly but daring to stay near. Daniel didn't move, didn't speak. He simply let him be, the warmth of companionship filling the silence. These weren't grand gestures, but for a dog who had only known pain, they were monumental steps. Neighbors noticed the subtle changes. "He looks calmer," one remarked, though skepticism still lingered in their tone. Daniel only smiled faintly, keeping the progress close to his heart. Each step was fragile, each breakthrough easily shattered by impatience, but Daniel refused to rush. Trust was not something demanded, it was something earned. And every storm weathered, every meal shared, every night spent a little closer proved the same truth. Beneath the scars and growls was a soul that wanted love, but had never been shown how to accept it. Slowly, the cracks in the armor were becoming doors. Progress was never a straight line. Just when Daniel thought the walls were crumbling, the pup reminded him how deep the scars ran. One morning, while he reached to adjust the dog's collar, the pup snapped without warning, teeth grazing. Daniel's hand. Blood welled instantly, sharp pain biting through his skin. Neighbors rushed to the fence at the sound of his startled cry. "That dog will turn on you," one warned coldly. Daniel wrapped his hand in a towel, staring at the trembling pup who had retreated into the corner, his body shaking with fear. He wasn't angry. He was terrified. The wound throbbed, but Daniel's heart ached more. He sat on the floor, hand still bleeding, and spoke softly. "I know you didn't mean it. You're just scared." The pup's eyes glistened, his ears pinned back as though bracing for punishment that never came. Daniel didn't shout, didn't raise his hand. Instead, he let the silence speak for him, proving with patience what others had only destroyed, with cruelty. Hours passed before the pup crept forward, nose twitching as he sniffed Daniel's bandaged hand. The smallest lick touched his skin, a fragile apology, a desperate plea for forgiveness. But patience had its cost. Friends visited, less neighbors kept their distance, and whispers followed Daniel wherever he went. "He should return that dog before something worse happens," they muttered. Some shook their heads in pity, others in judgment. Yet Daniel carried on, enduring shredded shoes, clawed furniture, and sleepless nights filled with anxious barking. Every setback was a reminder that healing was never quick. But he saw something no one else bothered to see, the fleeting moments when fear cracked and vulnerability peeked through. Those glimpses were enough to anchor him against doubt. One evening, exhausted after another chaotic day, Daniel sat on the porch with his head in his hands. The pup lay a few feet away, restless but watchful. The world saw disaster, but in that quiet, Daniel felt hope stirring. "We'll get there," he whispered into the night. The dog's ears flicked at his voice, his body settling slightly. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was the beginning of something stronger, and Daniel knew that if he gave up now, the pup would never learn what loyalty felt like. Patience wasn't his burden. It was his greatest weapon. It happened on a chilly evening, long after the sun had dipped behind the trees. Daniel was walking the pup down a quiet street, the leash loose but steady. The German shepherd was tense as always, ears pricked, every shadow a threat. Suddenly a figure darted from behind a parked car, someone rushing recklessly, their movements sharp and threatening. Daniel barely had time to react before the pup lunged forward, barking with a ferocity that split the night. His body placed, itself between Daniel and the stranger, teeth bared, stance unyielding. For the first time, the growl wasn't fear. It was protection. The stranger froze, hands raised in surprise. "Whoa, easy," he stammered, backing away quickly. Rex, though Daniel hadn't yet spoken the name aloud, held his ground until the man disappeared into the darkness. When silence returned, the pup didn't retreat into trembling. Instead, he turned his head toward Daniel, chest heaving, eyes sharp with focus. Daniel's heart pounded not from fear but from awe. In that single moment, the dog who had been written off as hateful had chosen him, not as an enemy but as someone worth defending. The bond had sparked into something real. Daniel crouched, his hands trembling as he stroked the pup's fur. For the first time, the German shepherd didn't flinch. He stood tall, steady, letting the touch linger. "You're not broken," Daniel whispered, his throat tight with emotion. "You're brave." The words hung in the cold air, and for the first time the pup's tail flicked. A hesitant, uncertain wag, but a sign of life nonetheless. Daniel smiled through the rush of relief, his chest swelling with pride. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was trust beginning to take root. From that night on, the world seemed different. The neighbors still doubted, the whispers still followed, but Daniel no longer carried the weight alone. The pup had proven himself in the simplest, most powerful way possible, by standing between danger and the man who refused to abandon him. The change wasn't immediate, but it was undeniable. Every glance carried less suspicion, every growl less venom. The turning point had arrived. The most hated pup had taken his first step toward becoming something more, something loyal, something fearless, something Daniel had believed in all along. The days that followed were quieter, not perfect but different. The pup still barked at strangers and flinched at sudden sounds, yet there was a softness creeping into his eyes. Training became their daily ritual. Daniel began with simple commands: sit, stay, come. At first, the dog resisted, growling at the leash, snapping in frustration. But Daniel's patience never wavered. Each success, no matter how small, was celebrated with gentle praise and a steady hand. Slowly, the German shepherd began to listen, his ears twitching at Daniel's voice, his growls fading into something closer to curiosity. Trust was taking shape. Even mealtime changed. Where once the pup snapped and guarded his bowl, now he allowed Daniel to place it down without fear. The first time he ate calmly, Daniel knelt nearby, not touching, just sitting in quiet company. It became a ritual. The dog eating, Daniel present, their silence filled with unspoken understanding. Soon, the growling stopped altogether. Mealtime became more than food. It became proof that safety was possible. Each day carried new victories. The leash no longer a battle, the front porch no longer a place of panic, the quiet nights less restless than before. The neighbors began to notice. Passing by, they still watched cautiously, but the pup no longer lunged at the fence. Instead, he stood tall, ears alert, but body calmer. A boy on a bicycle even rode past one afternoon without incident. Whispers shifted from warnings to questions. "Is that the same dog?" some asked, disbelief softening their tone. Daniel didn't boast, didn't argue. He just smiled quietly, letting the progress speak for itself. The pup, once branded as the most hated, was learning to live as more than a shadow of fear. Inside the home, the bond grew deeper. The dog followed Daniel from room to room, not too close but never too far. At night, he left the corner rug and curled at the foot of Daniel's bed. One morning, Daniel woke to find the pup's head resting gently on his boots. It was a gesture small enough to overlook, but to Daniel it was monumental. Loyalty was no longer a distant dream. It was becoming real, one step at a time. The transformation wasn't quick or easy, but it was undeniable. Together, they were rewriting the story no one else believed in. It began with small whispers around the neighborhood. People who once crossed the street to avoid Daniel's house now slowed their steps, curiosity tugging at them. They noticed the German shepherd sitting calmly on the porch instead of lunging at the fence. His eyes were still sharp, but his growls had softened into quiet watchfulness. Children who had once run past in fear now peeked from behind their parents, marveling at the change. "Is that the same dog?" one mother asked in disbelief. Daniel only smiled, his heart swelling with quiet pride. The world was finally beginning to see. At the local park, the transformation became undeniable. Where the pup had once barked uncontrollably at passing dogs, now he walked beside Daniel with cautious composure. A jogger stopped, stunned, watching the shepherd obey a simple sit command without hesitation. "Unbelievable," the man muttered. Word spread quickly. The most hated puppy was no longer the menace everyone feared. Neighbors whispered to friends, friends told their families, and soon the town began to talk. What was once mockery turned into reluctant admiration, a story retold in hushed tones that carried both shock and curiosity. Even the shelter staff who had labeled him unadoptable came to visit. They stood at the gate, jaws slack as they watched the once feared pup trot happily beside Daniel, tail swishing in contentment. One volunteer shook her head in disbelief. "I can't believe this is the same dog," she whispered. "We thought he'd never change." Another, wiping tears from her eyes, admitted, maybe all he needed was someone who refused to give up. For the first time, people saw beyond the growls and scars. They saw a creature learning to trust, learning to love. But admiration was not the only reaction. Some doubted, muttering that it wouldn't last, that the shepherd would snap again one day. Daniel ignored the skepticism, his focus steady on the bond growing between them. He didn't need the town's approval, he only needed the dog's trust. Yet deep inside, he couldn't deny the quiet satisfaction of proving everyone wrong. The world was watching, and for once, it wasn't with fear, it was with awe. The pup who had been branded as hopeless was becoming a living testament to what patience and love could create. Daniel had always wondered why the pup carried so much fear. The shelter had given him only fragments of information, abandoned near a construction site, no clear history. But late one evening, a volunteer stopped by his home holding a worn folder. "I thought you should know," she said softly. Inside were reports, scribbled notes, and photographs that told the story no one wanted to speak aloud. The pup hadn't just been abandoned. He had been abused. His first owner, frustrated by his energy, had used cruel methods to train him. The scars Daniel had seen weren't accidents. They were evidence of betrayal. Daniel's chest tightened as he read the details. The puppy had been locked outside for days without food, beaten when he barked, and shoved away when he tried to seek comfort. Every bite, every growl, every snap at the shelter suddenly made sense. He wasn't born angry. He had been taught that love was pain, that humans could not be trusted. Daniel closed the folder, his hands trembling. Across the room, the German shepherd lifted his head, sensing the heavy silence. His eyes met Daniel's, not with aggression but with the quiet vulnerability of someone waiting to be hurt again. He knelt beside the pup, tears burning in his eyes. "I'm sorry," Daniel whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry for everything they did to you." The dog flinched at first, but when Daniel's hand rested gently on his fur, no harshness followed. Instead, warmth radiated from the touch. For a moment, the shepherd froze. Then he leaned, just slightly, into Daniel's palm. It was small, almost imperceptible, but to Daniel it was monumental. It wasn't just trust, it was forgiveness. The wall between them had cracked open wider than ever before. From that day, Daniel carried the dog's past not as a burden, but as a promise. He trained with more patience, spoke with softer words, and never once raised his voice in anger. He knew the scars would never fully disappear, but they didn't have to define the pup's future. The town saw a dog transformed. Daniel saw something deeper, a soul that had been broken but was learning to heal. And in helping the shepherd face his past, Daniel found himself confronting his own loneliness, realizing that maybe, just maybe, they were saving each other. The weeks that followed marked the beginning of something extraordinary. Every morning, Daniel and the pup, now named Shadow, stepped outside together, not as strangers bound by a leash, but as companions learning to trust. Training sessions grew smoother. Commands once met with defiance were now answered with cautious obedience. "Sit," Daniel would say, and Shadow's body would lower, eyes locked on his. "Stay," and the dog would hold his ground, his tail twitching with effort but determination in every movement. Small victories became milestones, each one weaving their bond tighter. The world no longer saw aggression. They saw a partnership forming. Shadow followed Daniel everywhere, his paws padding softly behind him like a silent promise. Around the house, he became Daniel's shadow in truth, curling near his chair when he worked, lying by the door when he slept. The once lonely home now pulsed with life, barks that echoed not with fear but with joy, and the steady rhythm of paws against hardwood floors. Neighbors who had once muttered warnings now nodded respectfully when they passed. Daniel, once a invisible figure in the town, walked taller, pride radiating from the bond at his side. He wasn't just saving Shadow, Shadow was saving him. Together they ventured beyond the neighborhood. Walks became hikes through the forest, their silence filled with unspoken understanding. Daniel found comfort in the way Shadow's ears twitched at every rustle, the way he stood protectively when strangers approached. The dog who had once cowered in corners now walked like a sentinel, his confidence growing each day. And Daniel, who had carried loneliness like a weight, discovered that companionship didn't need words. Shadow's presence was enough, a steady reminder that love once broken could be rebuilt stronger than before. One evening as the sun bled gold across the horizon, Daniel sat on the porch with Shadow resting against his legs. He scratched gently behind the shepherd's ears, his voice low but full of emotion. "We're a team now. You and me. Stronger together." Shadow tilted his head, pressing his weight more firmly into Daniel's side, his tail thumping softly against the wood. It wasn't just trust anymore. It was loyalty, devotion, and something unshakable. In that quiet moment, Daniel realized they were no longer healing alone. They had become each other's anchor, and together they were unstoppable. It was a quiet evening when danger struck without warning. Daniel had left the back door open to let the cool breeze in, unaware that shadows were moving beyond the fence. A stranger crept across the yard, eyes scanning for an easy target. Daniel was inside, distracted when Shadow's ears pricked. The German shepherd froze, his body tense, every instinct on fire. A low growl rumbled in his chest, different from the fearful growls of his past. This one was steady, powerful, protective. Without hesitation, he positioned himself between the open door and his owner, his eyes locked on the intruder. The stranger stepped closer, a crowbar glinting in his hand. He hadn't expected resistance, especially not in the form of a towering German shepherd. Shadow erupted into action, his bark splitting the night like thunder. He lunged forward, teeth bared, his body a wall of fury and courage. The man stumbled back in shock, nearly dropping the weapon. Daniel rushed into the room, his heart racing as he saw the scene unfold. The dog everyone had once labeled dangerous was now the only thing standing between him and real harm. Neighbors spilled onto porches at the sound of the barking, lights flicking on across the street. The intruder, realizing his mistake, scrambled toward the fence. Shadow didn't give chase. He held his ground, snarling until the man disappeared into the night. When silence returned, Shadow remained planted firmly in front of Daniel, chest heaving, muscles coiled, refusing to move until he was sure the danger was gone. Daniel's hands shook as he reached down, voice breaking. "You saved me. You really saved me." Shadow turned his head, his eyes softening, as if to say, "This is who I was meant to be." The police arrived minutes later, taking statements and praising Shadow's bravery. But for Daniel, the real revelation came in the stillness after the chaos. He sank to his knees, pulling the dog close, his voice trembling with pride. "You're not the most hated dog anymore. You're my protector, my family." Shadow pressed, his head into Daniel's chest, his tail thumping softly. In that moment, the world's doubts, the scars of the past, and every whispered judgment melted away. The ultimate test had come, and Shadow had not only passed, he had proven he was more than anyone had ever believed. The story spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. By morning, everyone had heard about the break-in, and how the once feared German Shepherd had stood between his owner and danger. Neighbors who once avoided Daniel's home now stopped at the gate, their expressions filled with awe instead of suspicion. Children pressed their faces to the fence, whispering, "That's the hero dog." Parents, once warning their kids to stay away, now nodded respectfully at Daniel. Shadow no longer carried the weight of mistrust. He carried admiration. The whispers that once condemned him had become cheers of gratitude. At the local park, the transformation was undeniable. People who had crossed the path to avoid Shadow now approached, asking questions, offering praise. A boy who had once been terrified extended a timid hand, and to everyone's amazement, Shadow sniffed gently and allowed it. "He's different now," Daniel explained, pride warming his voice. He just needed someone to believe in him. Phones captured photos, and soon Shadow's story reached beyond the neighborhood. Social media posts painted him not as the hated pup, but as the unlikely hero. The world had finally changed its perspective. Even the shelter staff returned to see him, astonished by the dog's transformation. Tears welled in the eyes of the volunteer who once stamped his file with unadoptable. "I was wrong," she admitted softly, crouching as Shadow approached with cautious trust. "You were never a bad dog. You were just waiting for the right person." Daniel placed a hand on the shepherd's back, his voice steady. He was never broken. He just needed someone to stay. In that moment, the staff saw not a mistake, but a miracle, proof that no soul was beyond redemption. The town honored Shadow in a way Daniel never expected. At a small ceremony hosted by the community center, Shadow was given a medal engraved with the words, "Protector and Friend." Applause filled the room as Daniel knelt beside him, holding the medal against his chest. Shadow didn't understand the meaning, but he wagged his tail, his eyes fixed on the man who had saved him. Daniel smiled, his voice low but full of pride. "You earned this." The crowd stood together, not in fear but in respect, united by the truth. The most hated pup had become their greatest hero. The house that once echoed with silence was now alive with warmth. Shadow no longer paced nervously or growled at every sound. He lay stretched across the rug, eyes half closed, ears flicking lazily at Daniel's voice. The man sat nearby, his hands resting on the pup's thick fur, reflecting on how far they had come. From the most hated dog in the shelter to the town's unlikely hero, Shadow had transformed not just in behavior but in spirit. And Daniel knew deep down, it wasn't just the dog who had been saved. He too had been rescued in ways he never expected. Nights were no longer lonely. When storms rattled the windows, Shadow pressed close, his body a steady shield. When Daniel walked through town, he no longer walked alone. They had become inseparable, two souls once broken, now whole together. People stopped to greet them. Children called Shadow's name and strangers asked about his story. Each time, Daniel smiled softly. He was the one no one wanted, he would say. And every time, Shadow wagged his tail as though proud of his past, because it had led him to where he belonged. One evening, under a sky painted with fading gold, Daniel sat on the porch with Shadow leaning against his side. The town was quiet, the world at peace. He scratched behind the shepherd's ears, his voice steady and full of gratitude. "You're more than a dog to me. You're my family, my best friend." Shadow turned, pressing his head into Daniel's chest, his eyes shimmering with loyalty. It was a silent vow, one that needed no words. He would never leave, never falter, never stop protecting the man who gave him a chance. Their story became more than a tale of rescue. It became a testament to love, patience, and second chances. The dog who had once been labeled unworthy was now proof that no life was beyond redemption. And as Daniel whispered the words he'd carried all along, the truth rang clear. Sometimes the one no one wanted is the one who saves you. Shadow's tail thumped softly, his eyes closing in quiet contentment. Together, they had rewritten fate, not with grand gestures but with trust, loyalty, and love strong enough to silence every doubt. And that was their forever.